Hello, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you a collection of encounters from the deep western woods of Washington State, where rain falls nearly every day, and the moss grows thick enough to swallow sound itself. These aren't the stories you hear around campfires. These are the accounts we've gathered from rangers, loggers, and people who thought they understood what it meant to be alone in the forest. Blacktop Files specializes in long-form horror stories that feel disturbingly real, drawn from across the United States. Tonight's focus is the temperate rainforests of Washington, places like the Olympic Peninsula, the Hoh, the Knoll, the Carbon River valleys. These are some of the wettest, darkest, most isolated stretches of woodland in the lower 48. The canopy is so thick that midday can look like dusk. The ground is soft. The trails twist. And when something goes wrong out there, you're often hours from the nearest road, let alone help. What makes these particular cases unsettling is the consistency. Different people, different years, different parts of the forest, but the same wrongness. The same feeling that the trees are watching. The same sense that you've stepped into a place that has rules you don't understand and won't be told. If you want more horror that feels uncomfortably real, make sure to subscribe to Blacktop Files, turn on notifications so you never miss a file, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Let's start with a ranger who learned that some trails don't lead where the maps say they should. I was a backcountry ranger for the Olympic National Park for 6 years. I'd done trails all over the peninsula: Quinault, Dos Wallops, Elwha, Solduc. I knew how to handle weather, bears, lost hikers, all of it. The forest out there is wet, dense, and old. Sitka spruce taller than office buildings. Western red cedar so wide you could carve a room inside. Nurse logs covered in ferns and moss. It's beautiful, but it's also the kind of place where you can stand 10 feet off the trail and become completely invisible. This happened in late October, my 5th season. I was stationed at a remote patrol cabin near the Hoh River, about 8 miles in from the ranger station. My job was to check trail conditions, clear blowdowns, document wildlife, and assist any hikers who got into trouble. That time of year, the crowds were gone. Most days, I wouldn't see another person. The rain that month had been heavier than usual, even for the Hoh. The river was running high and brown. The trails were slick. I'd been radioing in reports every other day. Fallen trees, washed out sections, a few spots where the trail markers had been knocked down by wind. Standard stuff. On the day it started, I was checking a loop trail that branched off the main Hoh River Trail, heading east into a section of old growth that didn't get much traffic. It was supposed to be a 4-mile loop. I'd done it a dozen times. The trailhead was marked. The route was clear on my map and GPS. I left the cabin around 9 in the morning. The sky was low and gray, drizzle coming down steady like it always did. The first mile was fine. Mud, moss, the usual. I cleared a few small branches, checked the trail markers. Everything matched my map, but around the 2-mile point, I started noticing something off. The trail markers were there, metal diamonds nailed to the trees at eye level, but they were closer together than they should have been. Normally, you'd see one every 100 yards or so. Here they were every 30, 40 feet, like someone had added extras. I stopped and checked my GPS. The trail on the device matched where I was standing. I kept going. Another 1/4 mile, and I hit a fork that wasn't on my map. 2 paths, both wide enough to be official trails, both with markers. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure it out. I'd been through this section multiple times. There was no fork. Here. I radioed back to the main station, got static, tried again. Nothing. That wasn't unusual. Radio coverage in the valleys could be spotty. I checked my GPS again. It showed me on the correct trail, no fork indicated. I looked at both paths. One curved north, the other kept heading east. According to my position, I should keep going east. So I did. The trees got taller, the canopy thicker. The light dimmed even though it was only mid-morning. I started seeing more markers, sometimes 2 or 3 on the same tree. Some of them looked newer, the metal bright and clean. Others were old, rusted, half buried in moss. I couldn't make sense of it. If the Park Service had rerouted the trail, I would have been told. If volunteers had put up rogue markers, we would have removed them. I kept walking, another mile, maybe more. The trail started to narrow. The ground got softer, wetter. I could hear water running somewhere nearby, but I couldn't see a creek. The sound seemed to come from all around me. And then I realized I wasn't hearing the rain anymore. The drizzle had stopped, but the forest was still dripping. Every branch, every fern, every inch of moss. Water was falling in a constant quiet patter. It sounded wrong, too rhythmic, like it was timed. That's when I saw the cabin. It was just off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the trees. A small structure, wood-sided, covered in moss and blackberry vines. It looked old, but not falling apart. The roof was intact. The door was closed. I walked closer. There was no sign, no marker, no indication that it was a Park Service building. We had a few old cabins scattered through the backcountry. Historical structures, some maintained, some left to rot. But I didn't know about this one, and I thought I knew all of them. I tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was empty, except for a wooden bench along one wall and a stone fire pit in the center. No windows. The air smelled like damp earth and something else, something sour. The floor was dirt, but it was smooth, almost packed down like it had been walked on a lot. There was a pile of stones in the corner, stacked in a loose cairn. On the bench, someone had scratched marks into the wood. Tally marks. Dozens of them, maybe more than 100. I stepped back outside, checked my GPS. It showed me in the middle of the trail, nowhere near a structure. I looked at the cabin again. It was right there, solid, real. I decided to head back. Whatever this place was, I'd report it when I got back to the main station. I turned around and started walking the way I'd come. The trail looked the same, but the markers were different. Now they were on the left side of the trees instead of the right. I stopped and looked behind me. The markers I'd passed on the way in had been on the right. I was sure of it. I kept going. The trail started to twist more than I remembered. Corners I didn't recognize. Trees that seemed too large, too close together. I checked my GPS every few minutes. It kept saying I was on the right path, heading back toward the main trail. But nothing looked familiar. And the sound of dripping water was still everywhere. That same rhythm, like a clock ticking in the walls of the forest. After another hour, I found myself back at the fork. The same 2 paths, the same markers. I'd made a complete loop. That didn't make sense. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't taken a side trail. I'd followed the path straight back. I tried the other fork this time, the one heading north. It curved through a section of forest so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The trail was muddy, covered in wet leaves. I started seeing prints. Boot prints. Fresh, deep, like someone had just walked through. I stopped and crouched down. They weren't my prints. The tread was different. I looked ahead. The prints kept going, disappearing into the murk. I followed them for maybe half a mile. They never veered off the trail, never broke. Stride. And then they just stopped. Middle of the path, no reason. The last print was a left foot, pressed deep into the mud. After that, nothing. No sign anyone had turned around, stepped off into the brush, nothing, just gone. I stood there, staring at the mud, and I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, like someone calling from far away. I couldn't make out words, just a tone. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the forest off to the west. I called back. My voice didn't echo. It just disappeared into the moss and the trees like the forest swallowed it. I kept walking. The trail started to climb, winding uphill through a stretch of forest I didn't recognize at all. My GPS was still showing me on the correct route, but I knew that was wrong. I'd been through this area before. There was no climb like this on the loop. After another hour, I came out onto a ridge. Below me, I could see the valley and the river. It looked right, but I couldn't figure out where I was in relation to the cabin or the ranger station. The rain had started again, heavier now. I pulled out my map, tried to match the terrain. Nothing fit. I spent the night on that ridge. I didn't have much choice. It was getting dark, and I didn't trust the trail anymore. I set up my tarp, ate a protein bar, and tried the radio again. Static. My phone had no signal, not that I expected one out there. I sat under the tarp, listening to the rain hammer the fabric, and I kept hearing that voice. Faint, distant, rising and falling with the wind. I couldn't tell if it was real or if the forest was just playing tricks with the sound of water and branches. The next morning, I started downhill, trying to navigate by the river. It took me 6 hours to find a trail I recognized, and another 3 to get back to the ranger station. When I walked in, my supervisor looked at me like I'd been gone a month. I'd been out for less than 2 days. I reported everything. The fork, the cabin, the markers, the prints. They sent a crew out the next week to check. They found the loop trail exactly where it was supposed to be. No fork, no extra markers. They hiked the whole thing twice. No cabin, no cairn, no scratches on any bench. They checked the GPS logs from my device. According to the data, I'd never left the main trail. I stayed on for another season after that, but I never went back to that section of the Ho. I transferred to a station near the coast the year after, and eventually I left the Park Service altogether. I still hike, but not in the deep woods, not in the rainforest, and I don't trust trail markers anymore, because if the forest wants you to go somewhere, it'll make a path, and if it wants to keep you, the path won't lead out. The next account comes from a logger who spent 15 years working the private timberlands east of Forks, where the rain is just as heavy and the trees just as old. I worked as a faller for a timber company on the northwest edge of the Olympic Peninsula for a long time. Not in the park, that's all protected. We worked private land, company land, state leases. Second growth mostly, but there were still pockets of old growth mixed in. Trees the first loggers missed or couldn't reach. Those were the trees we were after. Big money in old cedar and spruce if you could get them out. This was back in the early 2000s. Crew of 8 working a site about 12 miles southeast of Forks. The access road was rough, washed out every winter, barely passable even with a 4-wheel drive. We'd haul in on trucks at dawn, work till dark, haul back out. Cold, wet, dangerous work. You had to pay attention every second. A widowmaker could drop on you from 100 feet up, and you'd never hear it coming through the rain and the saw noise. The site we were working that fall was strange from the start. It was a narrow valley, dense canopy, steep sides. The trees were old, older than most of the second growth we usually cut. Spruce, hemlock, some Douglas fir. The ground was thick with moss and ferns, and there were these massive nurse logs everywhere, half rotted, covered in saplings. The whole place smelled like decay and wet wood. We'd been there about 2 weeks when we started finding the marks. Carvings in the trees. Not fresh. These were old, grown over with bark. Some of them barely visible. Symbols, shapes. Things that didn't look like any language I knew. My supervisor said they were probably native old logging marks, something left over from the first cutting crews. He told us to ignore them. But they weren't just on the trees. We started seeing them on the nurse logs, on stones half buried in the moss, even scratched into the dirt on the skid roads we'd cleared. And they weren't random. They formed lines, patterns, circling the work site like something was marking a boundary. One of the guys on the crew, a younger faller, newer to the work, he started talking about it. Said it felt wrong, said the forest didn't want us there. The rest of us told him to shut up and focus. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel it too. There was a weight to that place. The light never seemed to reach the ground, even on the rare clear days, and the silence between the saw cuts was too deep. No birds, no squirrels, no wind. Just the drip of water and the creak of the trees. About 3 weeks in, we had our first accident. A guy named Torres was limbing a downed spruce when his saw kicked back and caught him across the forearm. Not a deep cut, but enough to need stitches. We got him out, got him to the clinic in Forks. He came back 2 days later, arm bandaged, and said he wasn't going back to that site. Quit the crew on the spot. Supervisor hired a replacement by the end of the week. The replacement didn't last long. His name was Milliken, older guy, ex-Navy, been logging for 20 years. Solid worker. But after his first day on site, he came back to the trucks and said he'd heard someone calling his name. Asked if we were screwing with him. We weren't. None of us had been near him. He was working a section on the south edge of the site, by himself like we all did. He said the voice had come from deeper in the trees, past the cutting boundary. A woman's voice, he said, clear as day. Calling his name 3 times, then stopping. We told him it was the wind, or maybe echo from the saws. He didn't buy it, but he didn't quit either. Stayed on for another week. Then one morning, he didn't show up at the truck. We waited 20 minutes, then went looking. Found him sitting on a stump about halfway to his cutting zone, staring into the trees. He didn't move when we called to him. Didn't blink. We had to physically pull him up and walk him back to the trucks. He wouldn't talk, just kept staring. Supervisor sent him home and told him not to come back. After that, the crew started falling apart. Guys calling in sick, making excuses, finding other jobs. We were down to 5, then 4. Supervisor kept pushing, kept saying we were almost done, just a few more weeks. But the work slowed. Equipment started breaking, saws jamming, chains snapping, trucks not starting. Things that shouldn't have gone wrong, and the marks kept showing up. New ones. Fresh carvings on trees we'd already cut. On stumps still bleeding sap. None of us were doing it. We'd all swear to that. But every morning there'd be more. And they were getting more detailed. Not just symbols anymore, but shapes. Human shapes, carved into the bark. Tall, thin figures with no faces, just smooth ovals where the heads should be. I started staying close to the trucks during lunch, not wandering off like I used to. The forest felt wrong by then. The silence was worse. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the underbrush, slow and deliberate. But when I'd look, there'd be nothing. Just ferns and moss and shadows. The day it ended, we were down to 3 of us. Me, the supervisor, and a guy named Ruiz. Audrey were working the last section, trying to finish so we could move to a different site. I was about 50 yards from Ruiz, felling a big hemlock near the edge of the cut zone. I'd made my notch, started my back cut, and I heard him yell. Not a work yell, not a warning, a scream. I killed my saw and ran. Found him standing in front of a tree we'd marked but hadn't cut yet. He was just staring at it. Saw dropped at his feet. I asked him what was wrong. He pointed at the tree. There were marks on it, fresh, cut deep into the bark. But these weren't symbols. These were words, carved in clean, straight letters about 6 feet up the trunk. They said, "Leave her alone." I looked at Ruiz. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Then the supervisor's voice came over the radio, asking what the holdup was. I told him we were coming back. We packed up the saws, loaded the trucks, and drove out. Supervisor argued with us for about 10 minutes, then gave up. We all knew we weren't going back. The company sent a different crew to finish the job a month later. I heard they got through it without any problems. No marks, no voices, no accidents. I don't know if that's true. I didn't ask for details. I kept working as a logger for a few more years. Different sites, different crews. But I never went back to that valley. And I never worked old growth again. There are some trees that should be left alone. Not because they're protected, not because they're sacred, but because they've been standing so long they've become something else. They've seen things, and they remember. Another case comes from the coast, where the rainforest meets the Pacific, and the fog rolls in thick enough to lose yourself in your own driveway. I lived on the coast, just south of Kalaloch, for 3 years, in a small house about a quarter mile from the beach. It was one of those places where the forest comes right up to the edge of the sand, where the trees grow stunted and twisted from the salt wind. My nearest neighbor was half a mile up the road. It was quiet, isolated, exactly what I wanted after spending 10 years in Seattle doing IT work I hated. The house was old, built in the 70s, single-story, wood siding, gone gray from the weather. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a big window that looked west toward the ocean. On clear days, you could see the waves. Most days, you couldn't see past the tree line. I moved in during late September. The owner had been renting it out as a vacation property, but it had been empty for a few months. The place needed work, leaky roof, drafty windows, floors that creaked with every step. But it was cheap, and I didn't mind fixing things. I spent the first few weeks patching, caulking, cleaning. The rain started in October and didn't stop. Some days it was a drizzle, some days it was a hammering downpour. I got used to it. Learned to sleep through the sound of water on the roof. The first time I heard the knocking, I thought it was a branch. The house was surrounded by trees. Shore pine, spruce, alder, and when the wind picked up, branches would scrape against the siding. But this wasn't scraping, it was knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the back door. I was in the kitchen when I heard it, making coffee around 6 in the morning. Still dark outside, rain coming down steady. I walked to the back door and turned on the porch light. Nothing. No one there. I opened the door, looked around. The porch was empty. The trees were still. I figured it was the wind playing tricks. Maybe a loose shutter or something shifting in the frame. I went back inside and forgot about it. It happened again 2 nights later. Same time, same pattern. 3 knocks, slow and evenly spaced. I was in the living room, reading. I got up, went to the back door, turned on the light. Nothing. This time I stepped outside, walked around the porch, checked the sides of the house. No branches, close enough to hit the door. No animals, no people, just rain and darkness. I started keeping a flashlight by the door. The knocking came every few nights after that. Always around the same time, always 3 knocks. I go to the door, look outside, find nothing. I check the door frame, thinking maybe it was loose, expanding and contracting with the temperature. It was solid. I asked my neighbor about it the next time I saw him at the general store in town. He shrugged, said it was probably the house settling or maybe a raccoon. He didn't seem concerned. But then the pattern changed. One night, the knocking came at 2 a.m. I woke up to it. 3 slow knocks, clear and loud. I lay in bed listening. It came again. 3 more knocks. Then silence. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, went to the back door, turned on the porch light. The yard was empty, but the rain had stopped. The forest was silent. No dripping, no wind, no sound at all. I stood there, looking out into the dark, and I realized the silence was wrong. It was too complete. Even on calm nights, you could hear the ocean, the faint crash of waves a quarter mile away. I couldn't hear it now. I couldn't hear anything. I closed the door and locked it. Went back to bed. Didn't sleep. The next night, the knocking came at midnight. 3 knocks, same door. I didn't get up. I lay in bed, waiting. It came again, then again, then again. Every few minutes, the same 3 knocks. I counted 11 rounds of knocking before it stopped. Each time I expected to hear footsteps, movement, something. But there was nothing between the knocks, just silence. I called the county sheriff's office the next morning. Told them someone might be harassing me, knocking on my door at night. They said they'd send a deputy out to check. A deputy came by that afternoon, walked around the property, looked at the doors and windows. Said there were no signs of anyone trying to break in. No prints, no damage. He asked if I'd seen anyone on the property. I said no. He told me to call if it happened again. It happened that night. 3 knocks at 2 a.m. I got up, flashlight in hand, went to the back door. This time, I didn't turn on the light. I stood in the dark, looking through the small window in the door. The porch was visible in the faint moonlight breaking through the clouds. There was no one there, but as I watched, I saw movement at the edge of the tree line. A shape, tall and thin, standing between 2 spruce trees. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the outline. It didn't move, it just stood there, facing the house. I turned on the porch light. The shape was gone, just trees and shadows. I opened the door, shone the flashlight into the yard. Nothing. I walked to the edge of the porch, scanned the tree line. Still nothing, but I could feel it. The weight of being watched. The certainty that something was out there, just past the light, waiting. I went back, inside, and locked the door. Pushed a chair against it. Sat in the living room with the flashlight and a kitchen knife until sunrise. The knocking came every night after that. Sometimes once, sometimes a dozen rounds. Always 3 knocks, always the same rhythm. I stopped going to the door, stopped turning on the lights. I'd lie in bed listening, counting the knocks, waiting for them to stop. And every time, after the knocking ended, I'd hear footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. Then silence. I started sleeping during the day, staying awake at night with the lights on. I kept the curtains closed. I didn't go outside after dark. My neighbor stopped by one afternoon, asked if I was okay. I told him about the knocking, the shape in the trees, the footsteps. He looked at me like I was losing it. Said the isolation could get to people, especially in the winter. Suggested I spend more time in town, around other people. I decided to leave. Packed my things, loaded the car, planned to drive out the next morning. That night, I sat in the living room waiting for dawn. The knocking came at midnight. 3 knocks. I didn't move. Then I heard something I hadn't heard before. A voice. faint, muffled, like it was coming from far away. It sounded like it was saying my name. I sat there frozen. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the back door. My name, spoken slowly, carefully. Then 3 more knocks. I grabbed my keys and walked out the front door. Drove straight through the night. Didn't stop until I hit Olympia. I called the landlord the next day, told him I was breaking the lease. He didn't argue. He said the previous tenant had left suddenly too. Said something about the house being too quiet. I never went back. I still live on the coast, but farther south in a neighborhood where the houses are close together and you can hear your neighbors through the walls. I don't mind the noise, it's better than the silence. And I don't answer knocks at the door anymore unless I'm expecting someone. Because I know now that not everything that knocks is looking to come in. Some things just want you to know they're there. What that man experienced might sound isolated, but this next narrator discovered that the rainforest doesn't keep its strangeness confined to remote cabins and empty roads. Sometimes it follows you home. I worked as a state wildlife biologist, based out of a field office near Amanda Park, on the southern edge of the Quinault rainforest. My job involved tracking elk herds, monitoring salmon runs, surveying for invasive species, that kind of thing. A lot of time in the field, a lot of time alone. I'd been doing it for about 8 years when this started. There's a section of forest along the upper Quinault River that's always been strange. It's old growth, thick canopy, minimal trails. The tribes in the area don't go there much. And the old-timers in Amanda Park will tell you stories if you ask them. Disappearances, strange lights, sounds that don't match any animal they know. I'd always written it off as local mythology, the kind of thing that builds up around isolated places. But I had to go there. Part of my job. We'd been tracking a small elk herd that had moved into that section during the fall, and I needed to document their range, check for signs of disease, take some population counts. I'd been putting it off, finding reasons to work other sites. But by late November, my supervisor was asking why I hadn't filed a report yet. I went in on a Thursday early morning, planning to be out by nightfall. The access was rough, overgrown logging road, barely passable, ending at a trailhead that didn't see much use. I hiked in about 4 miles, following the river, looking for sign. The forest was quiet, the usual dense, wet silence. I found some elk tracks near a gravel bar, took photos, documented the location. Standard work. But while I was crouched by the tracks, I noticed something else. Prints in the mud, near the water. Not elk, not deer, not bear. They were humanoid, barefoot, but wrong. Too long, too narrow. The toes spread out in a way that didn't match any human foot I'd seen. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. I took photos, measured them. 14 inches long, maybe 5 inches wide. Deep impressions, like whatever made them was heavy. I followed the prints for about 50 yards. They led away from the river, into the trees, then disappeared on a stretch of rocky ground. I looked around trying to find where they picked up again. Couldn't. I spent another hour searching, then decided to head back. I had the photos. I could file a report, maybe get someone else to come out and investigate. On the hike back, I kept feeling like I was being followed. I'd stop, listen, hear nothing, keep walking, feel it again. Eyes on my back, movement just out of sight. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was moving fast, almost jogging. I got in my truck, locked the doors, sat there for a minute, catching my breath. Felt ridiculous. I'd been in the woods alone 1,000 times. Never felt like that before. I drove back to the office, filed a preliminary report. included the photos of the prints. My supervisor looked them over, said they were probably just a deformed bear print, or maybe someone playing a prank. He didn't seem interested in following up. I let it drop. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the prints, the way they looked so deliberate, so purposeful. I kept seeing them in my head, the shape of the toes, the depth of the heel. Around 2 a.m, I got up, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table in my apartment in Hokkien. I lived on the 2nd floor of an old building downtown above a laundromat. Small place, 1 bedroom, not much to it. I was looking at the photos on my laptop when I heard something outside. A scraping sound like branches on the window. My apartment didn't have any trees near it. I got up, looked out the kitchen window. The street below was empty, lit by a single street light. No wind, no movement. I went back to the table, heard it again, scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from the bedroom window. I walked to the bedroom, turned on the light. The window faced an alley, narrow, dark, lined with dumpsters. I looked down. There was a figure standing in the alley directly below my window. Tall, impossibly tall, hunched slightly. It was too dark to see details, but I could make out the shape. Thin, angular, arms too long. I stepped back from the window, turned off the light, looked again. The figure was still there, but now it was looking up. I couldn't see a face, just a blank oval where the head should be. We stayed like that for a long time, me at the window, it in the alley, neither of us moving. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the alley. I stood at the window until sunrise, but it didn't come back. I called in sick the next day. Spent the day in my apartment, doors locked, curtains drawn. I kept checking the windows, looking for movement, didn't see anything. By evening, I was telling myself I'd imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, my mind playing tricks. But that night, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment. Slow, heavy steps, coming up from the ground floor. They stopped at my door. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, listening. No knock, no sound. Just the sense of something standing on the other side, waiting. I didn't open the door. I sat there until the footsteps started again, going back down the stairs. Then I heard the building's front door open and close. I went to the kitchen window, looked down at the street. The figure was there, standing under the streetlight, looking up at my window. This time I could see it more clearly. Tall, maybe 7 feet, thin, wearing what looked like dark, ragged clothes. The face was still wrong, still, featureless. It stood there for maybe 10 minutes, then walked away, heading west toward the edge of town. I left the next morning, drove to Olympia, stayed with a friend for a week, told my supervisor I had a family emergency. When I came back, I went straight to the office, told him I was putting in for a transfer. He asked why. I told him I needed a change, didn't go into details. He approved it. I was transferred to a site near Spokane by the end of the month. I never went back to that section of the Kino. Never filed a full report on the prints. I kept the photos, but I don't look at them anymore. And I don't work alone in the field anymore. I always make sure there's someone with me. Someone who can see what I see. Someone who can confirm I'm not imagining things. Because the worst part wasn't seeing it. The worst part was realizing it knew where I lived. It followed me out of the forest. And I don't think it was the first time something like that has happened. I think the forest has been sending things out for a long time, and most people who see them don't talk about it, because who would believe them? The next file involves a search and rescue volunteer who thought he understood how people got lost in the forest until he realized some of them weren't lost at all. I volunteered with a search and rescue group based out of Shelton for about 12 years. We covered a lot of ground: Olympic National Forest, parts of the park, private timberland. Most call-outs were straightforward: hikers who'd wandered off trail, hunters who'd gotten turned around, kids who'd gone farther than they should have. We'd find them cold, tired, maybe a little banged up, but alive. Occasionally, we'd find someone who hadn't made it. Exposure, injury, falls. It was hard, but it made sense. This case didn't make sense. It was February, middle of winter, cold and wet. We got a call out for a missing hiker in the Colonel Bob Wilderness, southeast of Lake Quinault. The hiker was a man in his 30s, experienced, well-equipped. He'd gone in alone for a 3-day trip, told his partner he'd be back by Sunday evening. When he didn't show up, she called it in Monday morning. We mobilized Tuesday at dawn. Team of 12 split into 3 groups. The weather was bad: freezing rain, wind, visibility maybe 100 feet. We started at the trailhead where his car was parked, worked our way up the main trail. His partner said he'd been planning to summit Colonel Bob, camp near the top, then loop back. Standard route, well marked. We found his first camp about 6 miles in, right where he'd said he'd be. Tent still standing, gear intact. Sleeping bag laid out. No sign of struggle, no indication he'd left in a hurry. But he was gone. We searched the area, called his name, nothing. We kept moving up the trail. About a mile farther, we found his pack, just sitting in the middle of the trail, upright, like he'd set it down carefully. Inside was his food, water, map, GPS, extra clothes, everything he'd need. No reason to leave it. That's when things got strange. One of the guys in my group found tracks leading off the trail, heading east into dense forest. Boot prints matched the hiker's size, but they weren't normal tracks. They were spaced too far apart, like he'd been running or leaping. We followed them for about 200 yards. They led to a ravine, steep-sided, thick with underbrush. The tracks went down into the ravine and didn't come back up. We called the other teams over, started searching the ravine. It was rough going, slick mud, tangled roots, devil's club everywhere. We found more tracks at the bottom, circling a small clearing, round and round like he'd been pacing. Then the tracks just stopped. Middle of the clearing, no explanation. No sign he'd climbed out, no drag marks, nothing. We searched that ravine for 2 days, brought in dogs. They picked up his scent at the clearing and then lost it, like it just ended. We expanded the search, covered miles in every direction. Never found him. Never found a body. The official report said he'd probably fallen into the river, that his body had been washed downstream and would turn up eventually. But I was there. I saw the clearing. I saw where the tracks ended. He didn't fall. He didn't leave. He just stopped being there. That case stayed with me. I started paying more attention to the other call-outs, the ones that didn't end well, and I started noticing a pattern. Not all of them, but enough. Missing hikers, hunters, campers. We'd find their gear, sometimes their camps, but no bodies. And when we did find tracks, they'd end the same way. Just stop, middle of nowhere, no explanation. There was a woman who went missing near the Wenatchee River. We found her camp, found her tracks leading away from it. She'd walked in a straight line for almost a mile, through dense forest, no trail, no deviation. Her tracks ended at the base of a massive cedar tree. Just ended. We searched around that tree for hours. Nothing. There was a hunter near the Skokomish. Same thing. Tracks leading into the forest, pacing in circles, then stopping. We found his rifle leaning against a tree, fully loaded. He was gone. I started asking the older volunteers if they'd seen this before. Most of them didn't want to talk about it. But one guy, been doing SR for 30 years, he pulled me aside after a briefing one night. He said there were places in the forest where people just vanished. No bodies, no explanations. He said it had been happening for decades, maybe longer. He said the forest took them, didn't elaborate, didn't need to. I kept volunteering for another 2 years after that, but I started refusing call-outs in certain areas. The deep stuff, the old growth, the places where the canopy was so thick you couldn't see the sky. I told my team leader I had scheduling conflicts. He didn't push. The last case I worked was in the spring near Lake Cushman. Missing hiker, solo trip, didn't come back. We found his tent, his pack, his tracks. Same pattern. Tracks leading away from camp, moving fast, no clear direction. They ended in a small meadow, circling a single tree. We searched that meadow for 3 days. Never found him. I quit the team after that. Told them I was moving, couldn't commit anymore. That was a lie. I just couldn't keep going into those woods, knowing what I knew. Because the worst part wasn't the missing people. The worst part was realizing that some of them were still out there. Not alive, not exactly, but not gone either. I'd see things sometimes on the edge of my vision while we were searching. Shapes moving between the trees, staying just out of sight. Tall, thin shapes that didn't move like animals or people. And I'd hear things. Voices calling from distances that didn't make sense. Saying names I recognized, names of people we'd been searching for. I don't go into the deep forest anymore. I don't volunteer. I don't hike alone. And when I hear about someone going missing in the Olympics, I don't wonder what happened. I already know the forest took them, and it's still taking them. One at a time, year after year. And no one talks about it. Because what would you even say? From the mountains, we moved to the valleys, where a surveyor learned that the forest doesn't just take people, it rearranges the land itself. I worked as a land surveyor for a civil engineering firm out of Port Angeles. My job was mostly property line surveys, boundary disputes, preparing sites for development. Sometimes I'd get sent out into remote areas, logging land, old homesteads, places that hadn't been surveyed in decades. That's what this was. A timber company had purchased a tract of land northwest of Lake Crescent, about 2,000 acres, and they needed an updated boundary survey before they could start cutting. The last survey on record was from 1952. I was supposed to go out, locate the old survey markers, metal pins, stone cairns, corner posts, and verify the boundaries matched the recorded plat. I went in solo. That wasn't unusual. Survey work is mostly solitary. You walk the lines, take measurements, document everything. I had a GPS unit, a compass, a metal detector, and copies of the old survey maps. The access was rough. Overgrown logging road hadn't been used in years. But I got my truck in about 3 miles, then hiked the rest of the way. The property was dense forest, mostly cedar and hemlock, with a few open areas where old clear cuts had started to regrow. The western boundary ran along a ridge overlooking the Lyre River. The eastern boundary followed a creek. The southern line was supposed to be marked by a series of stone cairns. That's where I started. The first cairn was easy to find. It was right where the map said it should be. A pile of stones about 3 feet high, mossy but intact. I documented it, took photos, marked the GPS coordinates, moved on to the second cairn about 600 feet east. Couldn't find it. I spent an hour searching, checking the map, rechecking my position. The GPS put me exactly where the cairn should be, but there was nothing. Just forest floor, moss, ferns. No stones, no indication anything had ever been there. I figured it had collapsed, stones scattered, maybe buried under decades of fallen leaves. I made a note and moved on to the third cairn. That one I found, but it was in the wrong place. According to the map, it should have been 600 feet east of the second cairn. It was only 300 feet, and it wasn't just off by a little. It was significantly out of position, almost 40 feet south of where it should have been. I checked the map again, checked my GPS. Everything said I was reading it right, but the cairn was wrong. I documented it and kept moving. By the time I'd checked half the southern boundary, I was finding markers that didn't match the recorded positions. Some were close, some were way off. Some were missing entirely. I started thinking the original survey had been sloppy, or maybe the maps I had were inaccurate. But these were professional surveys, done by licensed surveyors decades ago. They wouldn't have been this far off. I moved to the eastern boundary, following the creek. The map showed a series of metal pins driven into trees along the creek bank. I found the first two, rusted but readable. The third pin was in a tree that had fallen, half submerged in the creek. I had to wade in to check it. The fourth pin I couldn't find at all. The tree it was supposed to be in was gone. No stump, no sign it had ever been there. I spent 3 days working that property, and by the end nothing matched. Markers were missing, markers were in the wrong places, and some markers I found weren't on the map at all. New cairns, new pins, some of them clearly old, covered in moss and rust, but not documented in any survey I had. The worst part was the western boundary, the ridge overlooking the river. The map showed a straight line, marked by wooden posts, every 300 feet. I found the first post, rotted and leaning, but there. The second post was gone. The third post was there, but it was 100 feet north of where it should have been. And the fourth post I found wasn't a post at all. It was a stone marker, carved with a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked old, much older than the 1952 survey. The stone was weathered, the carving worn smooth. I took photos, documented it, moved on. The fifth marker was another stone, same symbol. The sixth marker was a cairn. None of these were on the map, but they formed a clear line, deliberate, evenly spaced. Someone had put them there. Someone who wasn't part of the recorded surveys. I followed that line for almost a mile. It didn't follow the property boundary. It cut across the tract at an angle, leading deeper into the forest, away from the ridge. I kept following it, even though I knew I was off task. I had to know where it went. It led to a clearing, small, circular, maybe 50 feet across. The ground was bare dirt, no moss, no ferns, nothing growing. In the center was a large stone, flat, smooth, covered in the same carvings I'd seen on the markers. The carvings formed a spiral, tightening toward the center. Around the stone were more cairns, 6 of them, evenly spaced, forming a ring. I stood there staring, trying to figure out what I was looking at. It wasn't a natural formation, it was too deliberate, but it wasn't part of any survey I knew. It wasn't on any map. I took photos, walked around the clearing, checking for anything else. Found more carvings on the trees at the edge, same spirals, same symbols. Then I noticed the light. It was wrong. The clearing should have been dark. Thick canopy, dense forest all around. But the light was bright, almost white, coming from everywhere and nowhere. No shadows, no direction, just flat, even light that made my eyes hurt. I backed out of the clearing, got my bearings, started heading back to the ridge, but I couldn't find it. I walked for an hour, checking my GPS, following the compass, and I kept ending up back at the clearing. Same stone, same cairns, same flat light. I tried a different direction. Same result. I tried following the creek. It led me back to the clearing. Every direction, every trail, every bearing led back to that same spot. I spent the night there. Didn't have a choice. I set up my tarp on the edge of the clearing, away from the stone, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. The light never changed. It stayed bright, flat, oppressive, and I kept hearing sounds. Not wind, not animals. Rhythmic sounds like breathing, like footsteps, circling the clearing just out of sight. At some point, I must have passed out. When I woke up, it was morning, real morning. The light was normal, the clearing was gone. I was lying on the forest floor, moss under me, trees all around. No stone, no cairns, no carvings, just forest. I got up, checked my GPS. I was 3 miles northeast of where I'd been. I had no memory of moving. I hiked back to my truck, loaded up, drove out. I filed a report with the firm, told them the old survey markers were unreliable. The boundaries couldn't be verified without a full resurvey. They sent someone else out to finish the job. I don't know what he found, I didn't ask. I kept working as a surveyor for a few more years, but I refused any jobs in the Olympics. I'd make excuses, say I was booked, pass them off to other guys in the office. Eventually, I left the firm altogether, moved east, started working development sites around Spokane. Flat land, clear boundaries, no surprises. But I still think about that clearing. The stone, the carvings, the light. I think about the markers that didn't match, the lines that didn't line up. And I think about what it means when the land itself changes, when the forest rewrites its own boundaries. Because if it can do that, if it can move markers and erase trails and trap people in places that shouldn't exist, then no map is reliable, no survey is accurate, and no one who goes into those woods can be sure they'll come out the same place they went in. The pattern continues inland, where a fire lookout discovered that watching the forest is not the same as understanding it. I worked as a fire lookout for the Forest Service, stationed in a tower on a ridge south of the Hoh rainforest. The tower was old, built in the 50s, steel frame on a concrete foundation with a small cabin on top. 10 by 10 feet, windows on all sides, a desk, a chair, a cot, and a propane stove. That was it. My job was to watch for smoke, report fires, monitor weather. I'd work 3-week rotations from June through September, living up there alone, coming down only to resupply. It was quiet work, solitary, which suited me fine. I'd done it for 5 seasons by the time this happened. I knew the routine. Wake up at dawn, scan the horizon, record weather data, check in with dispatch via radio twice a day. The rest of the time was mine. I'd read, write, watch the forest. The view was incredible. Miles of unbroken green, valleys, ridges, the distant peaks of the Olympics. On clear days, I could see all the way to the coast. This was my 6th season. I went up in early July. The weather was dry, which was unusual. Most years the rain lingered into summer, but this year the forest was already drying out. Fire risk was high. I spent the first week scanning constantly, logging every wisp of smoke, every lightning strike. Nothing major, just small spot fires that crews handled quickly. About 10 days in, I started noticing something odd. Every evening just after sunset, I'd see movement in the forest below. At first I thought it was elk or deer moving through the clearings, but the movement was wrong, too coordinated, too deliberate. I'd watch through binoculars and I'd see shapes, tall, thin shapes, moving between the trees in straight lines. They didn't move like animals. They moved like they had a destination. I mentioned it to dispatch during one of my check-ins. They said it was probably hikers, maybe a search and rescue exercise. But there were no trails down there, no reason for anyone to be moving through that section of forest. And the shapes moved at night when no one should have been hiking. I kept watching. Every evening, the same pattern. Shapes moving through the trees, always in the same direction, always heading north. I started marking their routes on my map, plotting their paths. After a few nights, I noticed they were converging on a single point, a valley about 3 miles northeast of the tower. I couldn't see into the valley from my position. Too steep, too densely forested. But all the shapes seemed to be heading there. I radioed dispatch again, asked if there was any activity planned in that area. They checked, came back, and said no. No logging, no trail work, no crews. They suggested I was seeing shadows, tricks of the light. But I knew what I was seeing. These weren't shadows. On the 15th night, I decided to get a better look. I waited until the shapes started moving, then grabbed my binoculars and watched. This time, I focused on one shape, tracking it as it moved through a clearing. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, thin with long arms. It moved smoothly, fluidly, not like it was walking, but like it was gliding. And it didn't have a face, just a smooth blank oval where the head should be. I put down the binoculars, felt my hands shaking, picked them up again. The shape was gone. I scanned the clearing, the tree line, nothing. Then I saw it again, much closer, at the edge of another clearing. It had moved a 1/4 mile in seconds. I watched it until it disappeared into the trees, heading toward the valley. Then I saw another shape, and another, 5, 6, maybe more, all moving in another same direction. I counted 12 before I stopped. They were all heading north, converging on that valley. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the desk, watching, documenting everything. By dawn, the shapes were gone. The forest looked normal, but I knew what I'd seen. I called dispatch as soon as I could, told them everything. The shapes, the valley, the patterns. They didn't believe me. They said I was stressed, isolated, maybe dehydrated. They suggested I come down early, take a break. I refused. I had a job to do. The next night, I didn't see any shapes, or the night after. The forest was quiet, normal. I started wondering if dispatch had been right, if I'd imagined it. But then, on the 18th night, I saw smoke. It was coming from the valley, the same place the shapes had been heading. Thin white smoke rising straight up in the still air. I reported it immediately. Dispatch said they'd send a crew to investigate. I watched the smoke all night. It never got bigger, never spread. Just a thin column rising from the valley, steady and controlled. The crew reached the valley the next afternoon. I listened to their radio chatter. They found the source of the smoke, a fire pit, stones arranged in a circle, still smoldering. No sign of who'd made it, no tracks, no camp. Just the fire pit. And around it, carvings in the trees. The crew described them as symbols, spirals, shapes that didn't match any language they knew. They documented it, put out the fire, and left. Dispatch asked me if I'd seen anyone in the area. I said no. I didn't mention the shapes. I knew they wouldn't believe me. The smoke didn't come back, the shapes didn't come back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still happening in that valley. Something I couldn't see from the tower. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie on the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. And I'd hear things. Faint sounds, like voices, coming from the forest below. I couldn't make out words, just tones, rising and falling like a chant. I finished the rotation, came down at the end of the month. told my supervisor I wasn't coming back next season. He asked why. I said I needed a change. He didn't push. I haven't been back to the Olympics since. I moved east, took a job working fire prevention in the Columbia Basin. Flat land, open skies, no forests. I don't watch the trees anymore. I don't look for smoke in the valleys. And I don't think about what I saw from that tower, because if I do, I have to accept that there are things moving through those forests at night. Things that have been there longer than the trees, longer than the trails, longer than any of us. And I have to accept that they're still there, still moving, still converging on places we can't see. And no one's going to stop them, because no one believes they exist. The final account comes from a man who spent his career cutting trails through the rainforest, only to realize that some paths were never meant to be walked. I worked trail maintenance for Olympic National Park for nearly 20 years. My job was to keep the trails clear, cutting back brush, clearing blowdowns, rebuilding bridges, maintaining drainage. It was hard, physical work, but I liked it. I liked being out in the forest, away from people, working with my hands. I knew those trails better than I knew the streets in my own town. The park has hundreds of miles of trails, some heavily used, some barely touched. The backcountry trails, the ones that lead deep into the wilderness, those were my specialty. I'd spend weeks at a time out there, camping in designated sites, working alone or with a small crew. The Ho, the Kino, the Elwha, the Bogachil, I worked them all. There was one trail I always avoided. It wasn't official. It didn't appear on any park map. But I knew it was there because I'd found it 3 times over the years, always in a different place. The first time was near the Ho, the second near the Queets, the third near the Dos Wallops. Each time it looked the same, a narrow path winding through dense forest, marked by stones stacked in small cairns. The path was clear, well maintained, like someone walked it regularly, but there were never any footprints. The first time I found it, I followed it for about a mile. I was curious. I wanted to know where it went. It wound through the trees, always heading deeper into the forest, always downhill. The canopy got thicker, the light dimmer. After a mile, I turned back. Something about the path felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. When I got back to the trailhead, I mentioned it to my supervisor. He said it was probably an old game trail, nothing to worry about. The second time, I didn't follow it. I just marked it on my GPS, documented the location, moved on. But when I checked the coordinates later, they didn't match any trail or feature I knew. The path was in a section of forest that should have been untouched, wilderness. The third time, I found it while I was working the Dos Wallops Trail, clearing blowdowns after a winter storm. I was about 10 miles in, working alone. I saw the cairns, recognized the path, and this time I got angry. I wanted to know who was building these trails, who was maintaining them. The park has strict rules about unauthorized trails. If someone was cutting paths through the back country, it was my job to report it. So I followed it. I told myself I'd just go far enough to figure out where it led. Then I'd turn back and file a report. I walked for an hour. The path kept going, winding through the trees, always downhill. The forest got darker, wetter. The moss was so thick it muffled my footsteps. I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing and the faint drip of water from the canopy. After an hour, I came to a clearing. It was small, circular, maybe 30 feet across. The ground was bare, no moss, no ferns, just dark, wet soil. In the center was a tree. Not a tree that had fallen, a tree that was upside down. The roots were in the air, the branches buried in the ground. It was massive, an old-growth spruce, and it was perfectly inverted, like someone had dug a hole deep enough to bury the crown and left the roots exposed. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at it. The roots were thick, tangled, covered in moss. They spread out like fingers, reaching toward the sky, and carved into the trunk just below where the roots started were symbols. The same spirals I'd seen in survey reports, the same shapes other people had described. They covered the trunk, hundreds of them, carved deep into the wood. I didn't go into the clearing. I didn't touch the tree. I just stood there, trying to understand what I was looking at. And then I heard it. A sound low and rhythmic, like breathing. It was coming from the tree, from inside the tree. I backed away, turned around, started walking back up the path, fast. The breathing followed me. I could hear it behind me, keeping pace, never getting closer, never falling back. I walked for what felt like hours, following the path, trying to get back to the main trail, but I couldn't find it. The path kept going, winding, turning, leading me deeper into the forest. I started to panic. I pulled out my GPS. It showed me in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest trail. I tried my radio, static. I kept walking, moving faster, almost running. The breathing was still there, still behind me, still keeping pace. And then I saw the cairns. The same cairns I'd passed on the way in. I was back at the clearing. The upside-down tree was there, the symbols, the bare ground. I hadn't turned around. I'd been walking away from it the entire time. But I was back. I tried again. Left the clearing, followed the path, moved as fast as I could. Same result. I ended up back at the clearing. I tried a third time. Same thing. No matter which direction I went, no matter how carefully I followed the path, I always ended up back at the clearing. I spent the night there. I didn't have a choice. I sat at the edge of the clearing, as far from the tree as I could get, and waited for dawn. The breathing never stopped. All night it came from the tree, slow and steady, like the forest itself was inhaling and exhaling. And I kept seeing movement in the trees around the clearing, shapes tall and thin, standing just outside the light, watching. When dawn came, the path was gone. I was sitting in the middle of the forest, no clearing, no tree, no symbols. Just normal woods, moss and ferns and fallen logs. I checked my GPS. I was half a mile from the Doe's Wallops Trail. I hiked out, got back to my truck, drove straight to the ranger station. I told my supervisor everything, the path, the clearing, the tree, the breathing. He listened, didn't say anything for a long time. Then he told me to take a few days off, said I'd been working too hard. I didn't argue, I took the time, but I didn't go back to work. I called him a week later, said I was resigning. He tried to talk me out of it. I told him I was done. I moved to Spokane not long after, got a job doing landscaping, working parks, mowing grass, safe, simple work. No forest, no trails. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. I stay in places where I can see the sky, where the trees are sparse and young, because I know now that those trails exist. They're out there, hidden, moving, leading people into places that don't follow the rules of the forest we think we know. And I know what's at the end of them. I saw it. I heard it. And I know that if I ever find that path again, I won't come back. The files we've shared tonight are part of a larger pattern. Accounts that span years and miles, but tell the same story. The rainforests of Washington are older than we understand, deeper than we map, and inhabited by things that have learned to exist alongside us, just out of sight. They don't need to be seen to be there. They don't need to be understood to be real. If these stories have stayed with you, if they've made you think twice about the trails you walk or the forest you enter, then you understand what Blacktop Files is about. This is horror that doesn't end when the video stops. This is horror that lives in the spaces between the trees, in the silence after the rain, in the paths that appear and disappear without reason. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Blacktop Files if you want more accounts like these. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next file. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Because no matter where you are, the forest is closer than you think.